rich tourist spat on a royal guard's face, believing their famous silence made them weak. But when this decorated veteran finally broke his stance, his response didn't just humble the man. It taught the world what true strength means. The summer sun beat down mercilessly on the grounds of Buckingham Palace, its golden rays reflecting off the ornate gates where hundreds of tourists gathered, phones raised high, to capture their brush with British royalty. Among the sea of excited faces and chattering voices stood Guard Thomas Blackwood, as still as the palace walls themselves, his red uniform pristine. Despite the sweltering August heat at 29, Blackwood was no ordinary guardsman. 8 years of service to the crown had earned him more than just the right to wear the prestigious uniform of the Queen's Guard. 2 tours in Afghanistan had taught him the true meaning of discipline, his valor earning him commendations that now sat quietly in his modest London flat. But here, standing at attention before Buckingham Palace, he served a different kind of duty every morning. Blackwood would rise before dawn, spending 3 meticulous hours preparing his uniform, each button polished to mirror shine, every strap and buckle aligned. With military precision, to some it might seem excessive for what tourists often dismissed as mere ceremonial dye beauty. But Blackwood knew better. The uniform he wore carried centuries of tradition, each crease and fold a testament to the unwavering dedication of those who came before him. It's not just about standing still, he would later recall of that fateful afternoon when we put on this uniform. We become living symbols of something greater than ourselves. Every tourist's photo, every child's wave, every attempted joke, we face it all with the dignity this position demands on an average day. Blackwood would encounter hundreds of tourists, their cameras flashing and children pointing. Most were respectful, some were amusing, and a few would try to provoke a reaction, a time-honored game that most guards had learned to take in stride. But this particular Thursday afternoon would prove different. Among the usual crowd of sightseers, a group of American tourists was making their way to Ward's post, led by a man whose expensive polo shirt and designer sunglasses couldn't quite mask his air of entitlement. The time was 2:30 p.m., the sun at its highest and the crowd at its thickest. None of the excited tourists snapping their photos could have guessed they were about to witness a moment that would challenge the very foundations of duty, discipline, and dignity. Not even Blackwood, who had maintained his composure through 8 years of service, through war and peace, through rain and shine, could have predicted how the next 17 minutes would test every ounce of his training. As the group of Americans drew closer, the air seemed to grow heavier with tension in his years of service. Blackwood had never once broken character, not in the worst weather, not under the most aggressive provocations, but as he caught sight of a young man approaching, Kevin Reynolds. Though Blackwood didn't know his name yet, something felt different. The man's expensive polo shirt and practiced smirk spoke of privilege and entitlement, a combination Blackwood had seen too many times before. As Reynolds sauntered closer with an all too familiar air of superiority, Blackwood would soon discover that every man, no matter how disciplined, has his limits. Kevin Reynolds wasn't accustomed to being ignored back in Texas. His family's oil money had always guaranteed him the attention he felt he deserved at the prestigious Dallas Country Club. Waiters would materialize at the slightest gesture in board meetings. Executives twice his age hung on his every word. Even here in London, his first-class flights, 5-star hotels, and exclusive restaurant reservations had maintained that comfortable bubble of deference he'd come to expect. But now, standing before the stoic figure of Guard Blackwood, Reynolds faced something his wealth couldn't influence: genuine, unmovable dignity. The morning had started typically enough for Reynolds: a champagne breakfast at the Ritz, where the matron had fawned over him appropriately, a shopping spree at Harrow's, where attendants had rushed to offer him private viewing rooms. But as the day wore on and the drinking continued, a familiar restlessness had begun to stir within him. That nagging need to prove himself, to assert his importance in increasingly dramatic ways. "Hey, look at this guy," Reynolds called out to his friends, his voice carrying the distinctive draw of old money. "Texas, bet you $50 I can make him crack." His 3 companions, already recording with their phones, snickered in anticipation. They'd spent the morning pub crawling through London's finest establishments, their American Express black cards opening doors that would have remained firmly closed to lesser mortals. And now, with liquid courage coursing through their veins, they were ready for what Reynolds called some real entertainment. The first attempts were predictable enough. Reynolds posed beside Blackwood for selfies, making exaggerated faces and throwing peace signs. "Come on, buddy, smile," for the camera his friends laughed, encouraged by the growing attention from other tourists who had stopped to watch. A small crowd began to form, their own phones raised to capture whatever might unfold. A street vendor nearby slowly pushed his cart away, sensing the brewing trouble. With the instinct of someone who'd seen similar scenes before, Blackwood remained motionless, his eyes fixed. Straight ahead in his mind, he recited the oath he'd taken years ago, letting the familiar words wash over him like armor he'd faced. Worse, much worse, the scars on his left shoulder from that firefight in Helmand Province were testament to that. He could still recall the whistle of bullets, the weight of his wounded comrade as he dragged him to safety, the grit of sand between his teeth as he'd called in air support. This was nothing, just another tourist who'd had too much to drink and forgot his manners. But Reynolds was just getting started. Emboldened by his audience and frustrated by Blackwood's composure, he stepped closer, the expensive scotch on his breath mingled with designer cologne as he invaded the guard's personal space. "What's with the funny hat, man? Did you lose a bet?" He reached up as if to touch the bare skin cap, stopping just short. Even in his inebriated state, some small part of him remembered the warnings about physically interfering with the guards. His hand hovered there, trembling slightly, as if testing the boundaries of his own courage. A middle-aged woman in the crowd spoke up, her British accent sharp with disapproval. "Approval, young man, show some respect." She clutched her handbag tighter, her knuckles white with indignation, but her words only seemed to fuel Reynolds's determination. He turned to the crowd with an exaggerated bow, playing to his growing audience like a seasoned performer who'd finally found his stage respect for what, standing there like a mannequin. Reynolds scoffed, his designer sunglasses catching the afternoon sun. The Ray-B bands cost more than some people's monthly salary, but they couldn't mask the emptiness in his eyes. "My tax dollars probably pay for this whole circus." The historical inaccuracy of his statement might have been amusing if his tone hadn't been so bitter, so deliberately provocative. A few American tourists in the crowd exchanged embarrassed glances, as if trying to distance themselves from their countrymen's behavior through it all. Blackwood remained still, but his mind was active. He noticed everything, the way Reynolds's friends had spread out to film from different angles, the uncomfortable shuffling of other tourists, the concerned glances from a palace security officer in the distance. 8 years of military service had taught him to observe, to assess, to prepare. He noted the slight sway in Reynolds' stance, the forced nature of his laugh, the way his right hand kept clenching and unclenching, signs of someone working themselves up to do something stupid. Something in Reynolds' demeanor was different from the usual troublemakers. There was a calculated edge to his actions, a deliberate escalation that set off warning bells in Blackwood's mind. The sun had shifted position, casting long shadows across the palace grounds. A cool breeze carried the distant chimes of Big Ben 3Y. Blackwood had been standing at his post since dawn, his muscles trained to maintain perfect stillness, despite the fatigue he'd learned. This discipline in military training perfected it during countless ceremonies, and now it served as both his armor and his weapon. "Maybe he's broken?" Reynolds announced, moving to stand directly in front of Blackwood. His expensive loafers scuffed against the pavement as he steadied himself. "Hey, robot, anyone home?" He waved his hand in front of Blackwood's face, close enough that the guard could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "Malin, 25. If Blackwood had to guess. Not that it made the disrespect any more palatable. The crowd had grown larger, now a mix of entertained onlookers and concerned observers. Some had stopped filming their discomfort, evident in their lowered phones and averted gazes. A young couple hurried their children away, shooting disapproving looks over their shoulders. Reynolds's friends, however, were ecstatic. "Ecstatic, this is going viral for sure." One called out, adjusting his camera angle for better coverage. He wore a Rolex that caught the sunlight with each movement. "Do the thing we talked about." Kev, their excitement had the desperate edge of people trying too hard to believe they were having fun. A young girl, no more than 7 or 8, tugged at her mother's sleeve. Her ice cream cone was melting, forgotten in her hand, as she watched the scene unfold with wide-eyed concern. "Mommy, why is that man being so mean?" The question, innocent and clear in the afternoon air, caused several onlookers to shift uncomfortably. A father pulled his son closer, whispering what appeared to be a lesson about respect, but Reynolds either didn't hear or chose to ignore it too far gone in his performance to register the impact of his actions. Instead, he turned to his audience, arms spread wide like a showman, his polo shirt damp with sweat. Despite its pristine brand name, clung to him as he swayed slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's time we found out if these guards are actually human." His voice had taken on a theatrical quality, but there was something ugly beneath the performance. A desperate need to prove something, to assert dominance over this symbol of authority and discipline that stood before for him, unflinching and unimpressed. It was the same tone he used in board meetings, when belittling junior executives at restaurants, when sending back perfectly good wine in life, when trying to fill the void his wealth couldn't touch. Blackwood felt his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly in Afghanistan. He'd learned to read people, to sense when a situation was about to escalate beyond the point of no return. That same instinct was screaming at him now. He could feel the weight of his ceremonial rifle, the press of his bare skin cap, the eyes of centuries of tradition watching through him. But his training held firm. He remained motionless, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance, even as Reynolds moved closer, even as the air grew thick with tension and anticipation. In his peripheral vision, he could see other tourists backing away, creating a circle of space around what was quickly becoming a moment of reckoning. What happened next would test not just Blackwood's training, but the very essence of what it meant to wear the uniform of the Queen's Guard. Reynolds, his expensive polo shirt now dampened with sweat from the afternoon heat, circled Blackwood like a predator testing its prey, but in his alcohol-addled mind, he failed to recognize one crucial detail. He wasn't the hunter here. 8 years of military service had made Blackwood acutely aware of every movement, every subtle shift in the air around him. "You know what?" I think Reynolds announced to his increasingly uncomfortable audience. "I think these guys are just scared. Scared to move. Scared to speak. Scared to be real." His words slurred slightly at the edges, betraying the liquid courage that fueled his bravado. "They hide behind tradition because they're too weak to face reality." Blackwood's mind flashed briefly to a morning in Helmand Province, where he'd held his position under heavy fire for 3 hours to protect a wounded colleague. Weak was not a word that featured in his vocabulary. Reynolds leaned in closer, his designer sunglasses now hanging loosely from his collar. "What do they even do here anyway? Stand around like statues while the world laughs at them?" He turned to his friends, who continued filming despite the visible discomfort on their faces. Even they seemed to sense that a line was about to be crossed. An elderly gentleman stepped forward from the crowd, his RAF veteran pin glinting in the sunlight. "Son, that's enough you've had. Your fun." But Reynolds was beyond hearing reason. The combination of expensive Scotch-wounded pride and an audience had created a perfect storm of poor judgment. "You want to know what I think of your precious tradition?" Reynolds's face contorted, with a mixture of contempt and desperate need for attention. Time seemed to slow as he gathered the saliva in his mouth. Later, dozens of videos would capture this moment from various angles, but none would fully convey the sudden, horrified silence that fell over the crowd. The spittle landed on Blackwood's cheek, just below his right eye, for a fraction of a second. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. The crowd's collective gasp created a vacuum of sound, as if all of London held its breath. Reynolds stood there, a triumphant smirk playing across his face, clearly expecting something, a reaction, a breakdown, a victory. What he got instead was far more terrifying. Blackwood didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. The saliva ran down his cheek like a tear, but his expression remained as immovable as the palace walls behind him. In that moment, the contrast between the two men couldn't have been starker, one swaying slightly from drink and misplaced confidence, the other standing as solid as an oak, dignity intact. Despite the ultimate insult, the silence was broken by the sound of running feet. Palace security had finally noticed the commotion, and uniformed officers were moving through the crowd. But it was the approaching footsteps from behind Blackwood that carried real weight. The rhythmic march of the guard captain and his patrol. Reynolds, suddenly, aware that his actions might have consequences, took a stumbling step backward. His friends had lowered their phones, the reality of what they'd just filmed finally sinking in. One of them muttered, "Kev, man, what did you do?" The crowd had expanded into a full circle now. Nobody wanting to stand too close to either man. Parents pulled their children back, but nobody left. They could sense that history was about to be made, though not in the way Reynolds had intended. For the first time since the incident began, Blackwood's eyes moved. They locked onto Reynolds with the same intensity that had once tracked enemy movements across Afghan mountains. In that gaze was not anger, not hatred, but something far more powerful, the weight of centuries of tradition. Honor and duty focused like a laser on one foolish soul who had dared to test its limits. Guard Captain Harrison's voice cut through the tension like a knife through butter. Guard. Stand down. The command, delivered with quiet authority, gave Blackwood permission to do something he hadn't done in 8 hours of duty. Move. The motion was deliberate, precise, and somehow more intimidating than any sudden action could have been. Blackwood pivoted 45 degrees, came to attention, and saluted his superior with textbook precision. Sir. Permission to address the situation. Granted, what happened next would be described by witnesses in dozens of different ways. Some would call it a speech, others a lesson, and still others would describe it as one of the most powerful moments they'd ever witnessed, but all would agree on one thing: they had never seen dignity quite like this. Blackwood reached up with a white-gloved hand and slowly wiped the spittle from his cheek. His movements were unhurried, almost ceremonial. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every soldier who had ever stood guard at these gates 8 years ago. I took an oath. He began, his words clear and measured, not just to the crown but to everything these gates represent: tradition, honor, sacrifice. His eyes found Reynolds, who had suddenly lost all traces of his previous bravado. While you were in that pub, working up the courage to come here and make a spectacle of yourself, I was standing guard over a history that stretches back centuries. The crowd was absolutely silent now, phones still recording but forgotten in hands that hung limply at their sides. Even Reynolds' friends had stopped their nervous shuffling. You see this uniform? Blackwood continued, his voice carrying across the courtyard. Before I earned the right to wear it, I served 2 tours in Afghanistan. I've watched brothers in arms fall defending the values you mock. This isn't a costume, sir. It's a symbol of dedication that you clearly cannot comprehend. He turned slightly, addressing the broader crowd. Now every day we stand here not as statues or tourist attractions, but as living reminders of the discipline, honor, and sacrifice that built and preserved this nation. We endure the heat, the cold, the rain, and yes, even the occasional fool who mistakes our discipline for weakness. Reynolds, attempting to salvage some dignity, opened his mouth to speak, but Captain Harrison's sharp glance silenced him immediately. 2 police officers had arrived and were standing ready, but they too seemed captivated by Blackwood's words. You wanted to know if we're human? Blackwood's voice took on a softer tone, though it lost none of its power. We are. We feel every insult, every joke, every attempt to break our composure, but we stand firm because that's what duty demands, because some things in this world are bigger than personal comfort or ego. Some traditions deserve respect even if you don't understand them. He turned back to Reynolds, who had begun to visibly shrink under the weight of the moment. You came here, hoping to create a viral video to get your moment of internet fame. Congratulations, sir. You've succeeded, but not in the way you intended. Instead of exposing weakness, you've demonstrated why we stand here day after day, because there must always be those who stand firm against disrespect, who maintain dignity in the face of ignorance, who remind others that honor isn't just an old-fashioned word. The elderly RAF veteran in the crowd nodded, slowly, tears visible in his eyes. Parents were drawing their children closer, speaking in hushed tones, explaining the significance of what they were witnessing. I don't expect an apology, Blackwood concluded, his voice carrying a note of finality. But I do hope that someday you'll understand what happened here. This isn't about you or me. It's about everything. We guard here not just the buildings and the people within them, but the principles they represent. With that, Blackwood turned back to Captain Harrison, saluted once more, and resumed his position with the same precision that marked his every movement. The spittle on his cheek had dried in the afternoon sun, leaving no visible mark. Much like how Reynolds' attempt to leave a stain on the institution had only served to make it shine brighter. The police officers stepped forward, now their duty clear. But the real judgment had already been delivered, not through force or anger, but through a display of character that would be remembered long after the handcuffs clicked into place. The arrest itself was almost anticlimactic after the power of Blackwood's words as the police officer's LED. Kevin Reynolds away, his designer sunglasses slipped from his collar and clattered to the ground. Forgotten his friends, those same young men who had been so eager to film his prank, now couldn't meet anyone's eyes as they shuffled away from the scene. Their phones finally lowered, assaulting a Queen's Guard. One of the officers explained, his voice carrying across the now hushed crowd. "That's a serious offense, sir. You'll have plenty of time to reflect on Guard Blackwood's words while we process your case." The videos, as expected, spread across social media like wildfire. But unlike the thousands of tourist pranks guard clips that populated the internet, this one struck a different chord. Within hours, multiple angles of the incident had been uploaded, each capturing a different perspective of the moment. Yet they all told the same story. Not of a guard's composure breaking, but of dignity triumphing over disrespect. "Respect the guard" began trending on Twitter within the hour. Comments flooded in from around the world. "This is what real strength looks like. Standing firm in the face of disrespect. That speech should be played in schools. Tradition, honor, duty, values. We need more than ever watch how he maintains his dignity. Even after being spat on." That's character. Reynolds' identity didn't stay private for long. His Texas oil fam's PR team scrambled to contain the damage, but the court of public opinion had already rendered its verdict. The same social media platforms he'd hoped would celebrate his bravery and challenging authority instead became a showcase for his humiliation. His LinkedIn profile was flooded with comments about respect and dignity. Several exclusive clubs in London quietly removed his name from their guest lists. But perhaps the most powerful consequences weren't the legal charges or the public shame. They were the conversations happening around dinner tables and in classrooms as parents and teachers used the incident to discuss respect duty and the importance of understanding traditions different from our own. A group of school children who had witnessed the incident wrote letters to Buckingham Palace, 9-year-olds. Words captured the sentiment perfectly. "Dear Guard Blackwood, today you taught us that being strong doesn't mean being mean. Sometimes the strongest thing is to be kind and respectful, even when others are not." Tourism officials reported an interesting shift in visitor behavior at Buckingham Palace in the days following the incident. Tourists still took photos with the guards, still smiled and waved, but there was a new undercurrent of respect. Parents could be heard explaining to their children not just what the guards did, but why they did it. The shallow jokes about making them laugh were replaced by genuine interest in the history and tradition. They represented Reynolds' case moved swiftly through the legal system. The judge's remarks during sentencing would later be quoted extensively in assaulting Guard Blackwood. "You didn't just attack individual, you attack the principles of duty, honor and respect that he represents. Your actions have served as a powerful reminder of why these values must be preserved and protected." The fine was substantial, but the requirement to perform community service at veterans organizations would prove far more impactful. Reynolds would later admit that nothing in his privileged life had prepared him for the humbling experience of serving those who had served their country. As for Guard Blackwood's viral moment, it found its way into training materials for military units and police forces around the world, not for his unwavering stance against provocation, but for his measured, dignified response. When finally addressing it, it became a case study in how to maintain authority, through character rather than force. But through it all, Blackwood remained unchanged. The next day, he resumed his post with the same dedication, the same precision, the same unwavering commitment to duty. The only difference was the added depth of respect in the eyes of those who now understood exactly what it meant to stand guard over not just a palace, but the principles it represented. What would you have done in Guard Blackwood's position? Could you maintain such dignity in the face of disrespect? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And here's a question to ponder. When was the last time you witnessed true strength shown through restraint rather than reaction? If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like and share it with someone who appreciates stories of dignity and honor. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of tradition and respect, and hit that bell icon to never miss an upload. Remember, real strength isn't about breaking others down. It's about standing firm in your values even when others try to break you.